couple of weeks ago, I gave you 5 surprise teams which I think will be at the 2026 World Cup. As we know, the tournament's increasing to 48 nations overall, so there's room for a few more. I'm going to give you 5 more teams that I think will be at the 2026 World Cup. Starting with number 1, Scotland. We're starting in Europe, specifically in the land of Haggis and Nessie. Now, they haven't appeared at a World Cup since France '98, but Steve Clarke has been doing a fantastic job since he's been appointed, and they've gone from strength to strength in the last 10 years through qualifying. They qualified for the Euros in 2020, although they didn't do too well in that tournament. However, afterwards, they really played well in their World Cup qualifiers, winning 7 matches and only losing 1 game, meaning that they had a playoff against Ukraine. Now, unfortunately, they lost to Ukraine 3-1 in the playoff at Hampden Park, maybe because this was Ukraine's first game since the Russian conflict, and it was highly emotional, and they had that extra sort of incentive to win. Finally, in 2020, Scotland won their Nations League group, which means they've now promoted to the A-League. They've got top players who play in the Premier League. I'm thinking of Andrew Robertson, Kieran Tierney, John McGinn, Che Adams, and some young players coming through as well, such as Billy Gilmore and Calvin Ramsey. They need to be taken seriously right now. As I say, they've progressed really well and improved in the last qualifying groups, going from 4th in 2014 and 2016 to 3rd in 2018 and 2020, and then of course earning a playoff place through the Nations League, and in 2020 finishing strong on 23 points in 2nd place. I think Scotland will keep getting better and keep evolving. With the players they've got and the youth coming through, I'm sure they'll be on the plane in 2026. Number 2, Oman. Over to the Asian Confederation and Oman, who are currently 75th in the FIFA rankings, placing them 9th amongst the Asian nations. With the new format, their new ranking would see them qualify for an intercontinental playoff spot. However, I think by the time qualifying comes around, they'll actually be pushing for one of those 8 automatic spots. As of recording, they just beat Saudi Arabia 2-1 in the Gold Cup, which means them and Iraq qualify level on 7 points to the next round. Iraq, who interestingly enough I picked in my last video, go and watch that if you haven't already. But back to Oman though, we really shouldn't be surprised that they've started well in 2023 because they had a great 2022. Only losing 3 games, all by 1-0, including to Germany in a pre-World Cup friendly. A game where they were described as spirited, good on the counter-attack, and could have scored if the forwards were more clinical. The team is led by former Iran manager Branko Ivankovic, who has managed domestic teams around the Gulf for a number of years and has been with Oman since 2020, picking up an impressive 50% win record. Oman are a decent team in a really competitive confederation. With the increased spots, I think they've got a really good chance of getting to the World Cup, and I'm backing them. Number 3, the Ivory Coast. I can read your minds. I know some of you are thinking, why the hell is he picking the Ivory Coast? That is not a surprise. Well, tell me when the Ivory Coast were last good. Because I can tell you, the Ivory Coast haven't been good since at least 2015 when they won the AFCON. They haven't appeared in a World Cup since 2014, and a lot of people still associate them as being this really good team, but they're thinking in the past of when they had lots of Drogba, Yaya Toure, Kolo Toure, Cheick Tiote. They just don't have that strong a team anymore. In 2022 qualification, they came 2nd in their group behind Cameroon, meaning they didn't advance to the final round, but that is despite only losing 1 game, which was to Cameroon. Since their 2015 AFCON win, they haven't progressed past the quarterfinals in that tournament. So how do they look now in 2023? Their squad's okay. They've got a nice mix of youth and some players that I like to think of in the last chance saloon, such as Zaha and Aurier, who will be desperate to get to the World Cup. If the format wasn't changing and we only had 5 African teams as normal, I don't think I'd be picking Ivory Coast. However, the new format to 9 teams is definitely in their favour. Even though they're not as good as lots of Morocco, Tunisia and Senegal, they are still better than a lot of the African nations. Probably enough to get themselves in the top 9, so I think they will be there. Number 4, El Salvador. So as you all know by now, USA, Canada and Mexico will be joint hosts of the 2026 World Cup. Now this leaves the CONCACAF Confederation with 3 spots and 2 intercontinental playoff spots. In my last video I predicted that Jamaica would be one of the surprise teams to get through, and I'm sticking by that. However, with the 2 intercontinental playoff spots that the CONCACAF have got, I think El Salvador will definitely get one of those places. My only concern is if you have a look at their friendly matches with nations outside of the CONCACAF, they've lost quite a lot in the last 3 years, losing to Iceland, Qatar twice, Japan, Bolivia, Chile and Peru. Now I know these are only friendlies, but it is useful to compare how they've actually got on against other teams to see how they would fare in a playoff. So you're probably thinking, why have you gone for El Salvador then? Well, listen to this. They hired Hugo Alvarado in 2020 as their first full-time scout. And it's an amazing story because he was just a fan who wanted to help in any way he could to improve the team. So he spent 10 years scouting and looking for players that would be eligible to play for El Salvador, contacting them through social media channels to see whether they would be interested and passing this information on to the Salvadorian FA. He eventually proved that not only were there loads of eligible players out there, but they were actually willing to play for El Salvador. Willing's the wrong word, they wanted to play for El Salvador. So going into 2026 qualifications, thanks to Hugo Alvarado, they've now got a bigger pool of players that they can pull from. And these players have been developed and coached in more advanced footballing nations. So therefore, El Salvador have got a great chance, I think. Definitely one to watch. Let's see how they get on in the Gold Cup later this year. Number 5, Peru. I left the CONMEBOL out of the last video, so I really wanted to include one nation from there this time, and the obvious candidate was Peru. Now, Peru have only qualified for one World Cup in 2018, and in 2022 they were really unlucky and had a playoff against Australia in which they lost on penalties, meaning that Australia went through to Qatar. And back home in the last 2 Copa Americas, they made it to the final and the semi-finals, losing to Brazil both times. So Peru are going through a pretty decent generation, qualifying for the World Cup in 2018, doing pretty well in the Copa America, just 1 penalty away from getting through to Qatar. South America will have 6 guaranteed spots with 1 additional playoff spot. We know the likes of Argentina, Brazil and Uruguay will qualify, so Peru's main competition is going to come from Colombia, Ecuador, Paraguay and Chile. And over the past couple of years, they've managed to win the majority of their games against these teams. Even if they finish 7th and have to settle for a playoff place, you'd still fancy their chances to qualify for the World Cup. And there you go, another 5 surprise nations that I think will be at the 2026 World Cup. You guys have been really great commenting on what your thoughts are, so please let me know in this video as well. Please subscribe, it really helps me out and enables me to make more content for you. Like as well, and I'll speak to you soon.